The roar of an AK-47 is a sound that once heard is never forgotten. But on the morning of February 13th, 1976, it sounded like the death knell of a nation's hope as General Murtala Ramat Mohammed sat defenseless in the back of his black Mercedes-Benz. It was his 200th day in office, a milestone that should have been celebrated with the progress of a reformed Nigeria, yet it ended in a jagged symphony of shattering glass and the metallic stench of spent gunpowder at a stagnant traffic junction in Ikoyi. As the bullets tore through the untinted windows, piercing the general's head, chest, and belly, the vibrant dreams of a 37-year-old leader were extinguished in a pool of crimson that stained the leather upholstery of his official vehicle. This was not just an assassination, it was a brutal massacre that saw the nation's most popular leader brought down in the prime of his life by men he believed he was leading toward a better future. The world stood still as news filtered out that the bold, stubborn, and incorrigible patriot had been left mangled in his car, marking the end of an era that had only just begun to breathe. Murtala Ramat Mohammed was a man who lived by the sword of his convictions, a soldier whose journey began in the ancient city of Kano and led him to the highest echelons of military power through sheer force of will and a refusal to back down. Born on November 8, 1938, his early life was shaped by the rigorous discipline of the Barewa College and later the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, where he forged the iron temperament that would later define his presidency. He was a man of many contradictions, deeply religious yet vindictive, a fierce patriot who loved his country but whose policies were often misconceived by those who feared his rapid pace of reform. After serving in the Congo and navigating the treacherous waters of the 1966 coups, he emerged not just as a military strategist, but as a symbol of northern strength and national unity, eventually changing his name to reflect a new identity as the head of the Nigerian state. His rise was meteoric, fueled by a desire to see Africa free from the shackles of colonialism and a vision to transform Nigeria into a continental powerhouse that could stand tall on the global stage. The morning of the assassination began like any other Friday in the Federal Capital Territory of Lagos, with the city waking up to the humid air and the usual chaotic rhythm of its streets. Murtala, adhering to his famous low-profile policy, refused the protection of a heavy military convoy, choosing instead to drive through the city like a common citizen, with only his driver, Sergeant Adamu Minchika, and his ADC, Lieutenant Akintunde Akinsahinwa. They departed from his unofficial residence in Ikoyi, heading toward Doden Barracks, unaware that shadows were moving in the periphery, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At the George Street traffic light, the Mercedes slowed to a halt, trapped by the very Lagos traffic that Murtala had hoped to solve through his infrastructure plans. It was here that the dissident soldiers, disguised in civilian attire and long flowing babanriga gowns, moved with professional precision, pulling hidden weapons from their robes and unleashing a torrent of lead that would change the course of Nigerian history forever. As the smoke cleared and the assassins fled toward the radio station, the scene at the traffic light was one of pure, unadulterated horror that sent shockwaves through the heart of Lagos. Bystanders, who moments ago were preparing for Valentine's Day festivities, scrambled for safety like Thompson's gazelles evading a cheetah, leaving their vehicles abandoned in the middle of the road. The general's body lay slumped, a stark contrast to the vibrant, energetic leader who had walked the halls of power just 24 hours earlier with a vision for 7 new states and a new capital in Abuja. The news of the massacre spread not through social media, but through the panicked whispers of eyewitnesses and the grim realization that the man who had promised to end corruption and drift had been silenced. Schools were shut down, parents dashed to pick up their children, and an eerie silence fell over the nation as it tipped toward a precipice of anarchy, wondering who would dare to fill the void left by the fallen general. The tragedy of Murtala's death was compounded by the fact that he was the youngest Nigerian head of state to die in office, a man who would not even reach the age of 40 before his journey was abruptly terminated. His death was a calculated strike by those who felt excluded from the halls of patronage, led by Lieutenant Colonel B.S. Dimka, who sought to undo the progress of the July 1975 coup. The assassination was so effective that the killers made absolutely sure there was no sign of life left in the vehicle before they made their escape, ensuring that their young revolutionaries could claim a hollow victory over a dead hero. As we look back at the relics of that Mercedes-Benz today, preserved in the National Museum, the bullet holes serve as a haunting reminder of a Friday the 13th that stained the Nigerian flag. This chapter of tremendous crime and history begins with this blood-soaked hook, because to understand the crime, one must first feel the weight of what was lost in those few seconds of violence.
To understand why Murtala Mohammed was marked for death, one must look back at his career as a military officer, specifically his controversial and lightning-fast role during the Nigerian Civil War. When the Republic of Biafra was declared in 1967 and its troops crossed the Niger Bridge into the Midwest, it was a 28-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Murtala who built the 2nd Division from scratch to halt the advance. His tactics were aggressive and often bordered on the reckless, as seen in his insistence on frontal river crossings at Onitsha, which resulted in the loss of thousands of men and millions of pounds in equipment. However, his successful lightning counteroffensive that cleared the Midwest in record time made him a household name, even as it brought him into direct conflict with the cautious leadership of General Yakubu Gowon. It was during this period that the seeds of rivalry were sown, as Murtala's charismatic and often stubborn nature made him a polarizing figure within the Supreme Headquarters, leading to his eventual temporary withdrawal from the front lines after the humiliating defeat at Abuja. The Asaba massacre remains the darkest shadow on Murtala's military legacy, a grim event where hundreds of able-bodied males were reportedly lined up and summarily executed by soldiers under his command. While the occurrence was never formally prosecuted by a board of inquiry, it created a lasting perception of Murtala as a man who would stop at nothing to achieve his military objectives, regardless of the human cost. This ruthless efficiency was what later made him the choice of the July 1975 coup plotters, who were tired of the indecision and drift they perceived under the Gowon administration. Murtala initially hesitated to join the plot, telling the conspirators he would not actively participate but would save their necks if they failed. Yet he ultimately emerged as the leader the nation demanded. Upon taking power, he didn't just rule, he performed a radical surgery on the Nigerian state, removing over 10,000 civil servants in a mass purge intended to instill discipline and accountability in a system that had become bloated and corrupt. His vision extended far beyond the military barracks, as he became the driving force behind the creation of the Federal Capital Territory in Abuja, recognizing that Lagos was becoming unsustainable as a seat of government. He was a man in a hurry, setting up panels to investigate abandoned properties, creating 7 new states to balance ethnic tensions, and drafting a transition program to hand power back to civilians by 1979. His foreign policy was equally assertive, famously rebuffing the interference of Western powers and declaring that Africa was no longer under the thumb of colonial masters, a stance that earned him the adoration of Pan-Africanists across the continent. Yet every reform he made created a new enemy. Every official he fired became a potential conspirator, and every bold speech he delivered added a layer of resentment among those who benefited from the previous status quo. The shadows of his past in the Civil War and the enemies made during his 200 days as head of state were slowly converging into a lethal plot that would manifest in the heart of Ikoyi. Why you must subscribe to Tremendous Crime in History. History isn't just a list of dates. It is a series of high-stakes crimes that shaped the world we live in today. By subscribing to this channel, you gain access to deeply researched cinematic retellings of the most notorious events in human history, ensuring you never miss the hidden details that textbooks leave out. We dive into the why and how of history's greatest heists, assassinations, and conspiracies. Subscribe now to join a community that values the truth behind the headlines and the lessons we must take from the past to protect our future. The relationship between Murtala and his fellow officers was a complex web of loyalty and suspicion, particularly with his deputy, Olusegun Obasanjo, and the Chief of Army Staff, Theophilus Danjuma. Murtala had initially demanded full executive authority, but was forced to share power in a triumvirate, a move that created internal friction from the very first day of his administration. His promotion to a 4-star general in January 1976 further complicated matters, as it shifted the seniority dynamics within the military hierarchy, placing younger officers like Danjuma in positions that frustrated senior regulars like Major General Ilya Bisala. Bisala, who had commanded Danjuma during the war, now found himself reporting to his former junior, a slight that many believe fueled his involvement in the coming coup. As Murtala continued to brush off warnings about his safety, the young revolutionaries led by B.S. Dimka were finalizing their plans, fueled by a mixture of ethnic grievances, professional jealousy, and a desire to return General Gowon to power.
When the first shots rang out at 8 a.m. on that fateful Friday, the leader of the hit squad, Lieutenant Colonel B.S. Dimka, believed he was initiating a glorious revolution that would restore the rightful order of the Nigerian army. Dimka was a man of the physical training corps, known more for his social habits and love for alcohol than for political strategy, yet he managed to coordinate a strike that was surgically precise in its violence. While the general lay dying in his car, Dimka and his men did not stop to help the civilians caught in the crossfire. They raced toward the Nigerian Broadcasting Corporation, NBC, in Ikoyi to seize the airwaves. Their goal was simple: announce the death of the deficiency-detected leader and impose a curfew that would freeze the nation in place while they consolidated power. The broadcast that followed was a rambling, disjointed message that spoke of young revolutionaries and warned that any attempt to foil their plan would be met with immediate death, a threat that sent the city of Lagos into a state of paralyzed terror. History is often a matter of seconds. If Murtala's car hadn't hit that specific traffic light, would Nigeria be a different country today? Tell us what you think. The confusion following the broadcast was total, as most Nigerians had no idea if the entire government had fallen or if it was merely a localized mutiny within the Lagos Signals Unit. In the NBC building, Dimka stood over the radio technicians, forcing them to play martial music between his announcements, a haunting soundtrack that signaled the end of the 200-day honeymoon of the Murtala administration. Meanwhile, at the Supreme Headquarters, the surviving members of the government, including Obasanjo and Danjuma, were scrambling to assess the loyalty of the various military formations across the country. It was a race against time. If Dimka could convince the brigade commanders in Kaduna, Enugu, and Benin to support him, the coup would succeed, and Nigeria would fall back into the hands of the very cabal Murtala had ousted. The tension was thick enough to cut with a bayonet, as officers who had eaten together just days before now stared at each other across the barrels of their rifles, wondering who was a patriot and who was a traitor. The reaction from the public was not the celebration Dimka had expected, but a visceral, angry disapproval that manifested in spontaneous protests by university students in Lagos and Ibadan. The people had fallen in love with Murtala's boldness, his decision to move the capital to Abuja, and his uncompromising stance against corruption, and they saw Dimka's coup as a barbaric theft of their future. This popular support for the fallen general gave the loyalist troops the moral high ground they needed to launch a counterattack against the conspirators who were still holed up in the radio station. Colonel Ibrahim Babangida, a rising star in the army and a man who knew Dimka personally, was tasked with the dangerous mission of dislodging the assassins from the NBC building. Armed with his wits and, as some legends say, a bottle of alcohol to exploit Dimka's known vice, Babangida entered the lion's den to negotiate or neutralize the threat, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic confrontations in Nigerian military history. As Babangida's troops surrounded the radio station, the revolutionary fervor of Dimka's group began to evaporate, replaced by the grim realization that they were isolated and outgunned. The counter-broadcasts from brigade commanders like Colonel Muhammadu Buhari in Benin and Colonel M.V. Vatsa in Calabar signaled that the military as a whole was not going to follow Dimka into the abyss of another civil war.
Sensing the walls closing in, Dimka abandoned his post at the radio station, slipping through the back exits and disappearing into the dense urban jungle of Lagos before the loyalists could secure the perimeter. He left behind a city in shock, a dead head of state, and a government that was now missing its heart, as the nation waited with bated breath to see if the killers would ever be brought to justice. The assassination had succeeded in its primary goal, but the coup itself was crumbling, leaving a trail of blood and unanswered questions that would haunt the Nigerian psyche for decades to come. The morning ended with the official confirmation of Murtala Mohammed's death, a newsflash that broke the hearts of millions across Africa and the world who had seen him as the continent's new hope. The image of the bullet-riddled Mercedes became an instant icon of tragedy, a symbol of a man who was too popular to be protected and whose trust in his own people had been his ultimate downfall. The 200 days were over, and as the evening sun began to set over Lagos, the task of transporting the general's remains back to his ancestral home in Kano began. It was a somber procession, a journey from the chaos of a failed coup to the quiet dignity of an Islamic burial, where the man who wanted to transform Nigeria was finally laid to rest. But the crime was far from over. The manhunt for B.S. Dimka was just beginning, and the revelations that would emerge from the coming court-martial would implicate some of the most powerful names in the land.
The escape of B.S. Dimka triggered the largest manhunt in West African history, as the Nigerian security apparatus was mobilized to capture the man who had pulled the trigger on the nation's dreams. Dimka was a smart military officer, trained in Australia and seasoned by years of service, and he knew how to move through the shadows to avoid the roadblocks that were being mounted every few miles. He first fled to Jos, his home region in Plateau State, hoping to find sanctuary among his kinsmen, but the radio announcements were relentless, broadcasting his name and face every 5 minutes across every available frequency. He was a marked man, a fugitive whose very presence brought death and ruin to anyone who dared to hide him, forcing him to move again, this time toward the border regions of the east. His destination was Abakaliki, a place he knew well from his service during the Civil War, a town where he believed he could melt into the local population and disappear into the history he had tried to destroy. Upon arriving in Abakaliki, Dimka made the fatal mistake of underestimating the memory of the local people and the power of the news that had turned him into a national villain. He checked in to the Friendship Hotel, a modest establishment where he hoped to rest and plan his final escape across the border, but his arrogance remained even in his desperation. He requested the hotel manager to find his former girlfriend, a woman named Ugo, wanting her to spend the night with him as if he were a returning hero rather than a fleeing assassin. There were no telephones in the area, so the manager had to physically walk to Ugo's house to deliver the message, a delay that gave the military authorities time to close in on his location. Dimka, ever suspicious, insisted on being moved to a room without iron protectors on the windows, a choice that showed he was already planning his next exit even before he had laid his head down to sleep. The night at the Friendship Hotel was a tense standoff between love and duty, as Ugo arrived to find a man who was a shell of the officer she once knew, haunted by the magnitude of his crime and the certainty of his fate. As they lay in the room, the sound of military boots began to echo in the hallway. The loyalist troops had finally tracked the scent of the traitor to the heart of Abakaliki. In the dead of night, as the soldiers kicked in the door, Dimka's military training kicked in. He dove through the unprotected window, vanishing into the nearby bush just as the light of the soldiers' torches filled the room. He left Ugo behind to face the interrogation and the wrath of the army, fleeing into the darkness like a common thief, his pride finally shattered by the reality of his isolation. He crawled through the undergrowth, scratched by thorns and driven by a primal fear of the firing squad, until he reached a main road where he hailed a taxi, still hoping against hope that he could outrun justice. But the road was long, and the eyes of Nigeria were everywhere, from the smallest villages to the largest police checkpoints. Dimka realized that the borders were closed, his friends were in shackles, and his name was a curse on the lips of every Nigerian from Kano to Lagos. At a final police checkpoint,
Sensing that his journey had reached its inevitable conclusion, he did the unthinkable. He stepped out of the shadows and surrendered to a simple policeman. Stretching out his hands for the cuffs, he uttered the words that would go down in the annals of tremendous crime. "I am Dimka, the man you have been looking for." It was a moment of surreal clarity, the end of a chase that had spanned hundreds of miles and millions of heartbeats, bringing the leader of the young revolutionaries back to the very city where he had spilled the blood of a general. Dimka was flown back to Lagos under heavy guard, a prisoner of the state he had tried to topple, facing a nation that was hungry for answers and thirsty for retribution. The investigation that followed was a grueling process of confessions and betrayals, as Dimka, now nicknamed the Parrot for how much he spoke, began to name his accomplices and those he claimed were behind the plot. He spoke of secret meetings in London, of conversations with the exiled General Yakubu Gowon, and of the involvement of senior officers like Major General Bisala, who he claimed had blessed the assassination. Whether his words were the truth or the desperate lies of a man trying to save his neck, they tore the military apart, leading to a series of arrests that saw the elite of the Nigerian army brought before a military court-martial. The manhunt was over, but the trial was about to uncover a conspiracy that went much deeper than a single traffic light in Ikoyi.
The trial of B.S. Dimka and his co-conspirators was a spectacle of military justice that gripped the nation, held behind the closed doors of a high-security tribunal where the secrets of the coup were finally laid bare. Dimka, despite his earlier flight, appeared before the judges with a strange sense of defiance, admitting that he had indeed carried out the assassination of Murtala Mohammed because he believed the general's government was deficient. He was a man who seemed to relish the attention, pouring out a confessional statement that implicated over 30 officers and civilians, creating a web of guilt that the tribunal struggled to untangle. Among the accused was Major General Ilya Bisala, the Minister of Defense, who stood stoically as Dimka described how the coup was planned to restore Gowon to power. Bisala denied the charges until the end, but the evidence of his silence and his secret meetings with the plotters was enough to seal his fate in a time of national mourning and rage. The tribunal's findings were swift and uncompromising, reflecting the government's need to demonstrate that any threat to the state would be met with the ultimate penalty. For the crime of treason and the murder of the head of state, Dimka, Bisala, and several others were sentenced to death by firing squad, a sentence that was received with a mixture of somber satisfaction and lingering grief by the public. The government also made a formal demand to the British Queen for the repatriation of Yakubu Gowon, claiming that Dimka had visited him in London to discuss the plot. Gowon denied any involvement, and the British government refused to hand him over, a diplomatic standoff that resulted in Gowon being dismissed from the army in absentia and stripped of his rank. While the big fish in London remained out of reach, the conspirators in Lagos had no such sanctuary. They were moved to the holding cells, awaiting the final walk to the stakes at Bar Beach. The day of the execution was a grim climax to the tragedy, as thousands of Nigerians gathered at the sands of Bar Beach to witness the end of the men who had killed their hero. The prisoners were tied to heavy wooden stakes, their backs to the Atlantic Ocean, facing a firing squad of their fellow soldiers who had been tasked with the most difficult duty of their careers. Dimka, ever the controversial figure, remained a soldier to the very last second. It is reported that he commanded the junior officer assigned to shoot him to first salute him as a superior officer before pulling the trigger. It was a final, hollow gesture of military pride from a man who had violated the most sacred oath of his profession. When the order to fire was given, the volley of bullets ended the lives of the plotters, but it could not erase the memory of the blood spilled on that Friday the 13th in Ikoyi. The execution served as a brutal period at the end of a sentence of violence, but it left the military leadership under Obasanjo and Danjuma in a state of deep introspection and fear. They had survived the coup, but they knew that the seeds of discord still remained within the ranks, fueled by ethnic tensions and the rapid pace of the reforms Murtala had initiated. The death of Bisala, a popular regular officer, was particularly painful for many in the army, leading to a lingering sense of what if that would influence Nigerian politics for the next generation. The Bar Beach executions were meant to be a deterrent, a sign that the tremendous crimes of the past would not be tolerated in the new Nigeria. Yet the scars of the trial and the sight of senior generals being tied to stakes remained a haunting image in the national memory. The nation had its justice, but it still didn't have its leader, and the void left by Murtala was one that no firing squad could ever fill. As the bodies were taken away and the crowds dispersed from Bar Beach, the reality of the post-Murtala era began to settle over the country like a cold fog. The 200 days were a brief shining moment of discipline and vision that had been cut short by the very chaos Murtala had sought to eliminate. The trial had shown that the threat came not from external enemies, but from within, from the desks of the Ministry of Defense and the social clubs of the military elite. The tremendous crime was not just the assassination, but the betrayal of a national movement by men who put their personal grievances above the collective progress of millions. In the end, Dimka died as he lived, controversial, defiant, and ultimately destructive, leaving behind a legacy of good tidings that brought nothing but sorrow to the land he claimed to be saving.
General Murtala Ramat Mohammed may have only ruled for 200 days, but his impact on Nigeria was so profound that his name remains a synonym for courage and radical reform half a century later. He was the only Nigerian leader to die before the age of 40, a young man who achieved in months what others failed to do in decades, leaving behind a blueprint for a nation that is still being debated today. His face stares back at every Nigerian from the 20 naira note, the only military man to be so honored, a daily reminder of the price of patriotism and the fragility of life. The Murtala Mohammed International Airport in Lagos stands as a gateway to the nation, a monument to a man who wanted Nigeria to fly high and proud among the nations of the world, even if his own wings were clipped by a volley of bullets. His marriage to Ajoke Mohammed, a Yoruba woman, stood as a personal symbol of the detribalized Nigeria he hoped to build, a union of North and South that survived even his untimely death. The move to Abuja, the creation of new states, and the purge of the civil service were the three pillars of his administration that changed the map and the soul of the country forever. While critics still point to the Asaba massacre and the lack of due process in his mass firings as evidence of a flawed character, his supporters see a man who is willing to break the law to save the nation. He was the authentic, eager, bold, popular, and stubborn leader that Nigeria needed at a time of drift, a man whose religious devotion didn't stop him from being a practical and often ruthless administrator. His funeral in Kano was attended by hundreds of thousands of mourners, a sea of people who wept for a leader they felt truly loved them, a rare sight in a continent where leaders were often feared more than they were admired. He was buried according to Islamic rites on the same day he died, returning to the dust of Kano as a martyr for the Nigerian cause. The transition to civilian rule, which he had promised for 1979, was faithfully carried out by his successor, Olusegun Obasanjo, proving that Murtala's vision was stronger than the bullets that killed him. This transition was the ultimate victory over Dimka and the conspirators, as it showed that the Nigerian state could survive the assassination of its head and continue on its path toward democracy. The lessons of his life are clear, that true leadership requires the courage to make enemies, and that a leader's greatest protection is the love of his people, even if that love cannot stop an assassin's bullet. His story is a staple of tremendous crime in history because it represents the ultimate conflict between progress and reaction, between the hope of a new generation and the greed of the old guard. He remains a hero to the youth, a man whose image on the currency serves as a constant challenge to those who hold power today to live up to his standard of discipline. As we conclude this narrative of the Black Friday of 1976, we must remember that history is not just about the people who win, but about the ideas that refuse to die. Murtala Mohammed was killed, but the idea of a disciplined, united, and proud Nigeria lived on in the institutions he founded and the capital city he envisioned. The crime of his assassination was a wound that healed into a scar, a permanent part of the Nigerian identity that reminds the nation of what happens when deficiency is detected in the security of its leaders. His 200 days were a sprint, a high-speed chase toward a better future that ended in a tragic crash. But the tracks he left behind still guide the nation's journey toward the Abuja he dreamed of. He was a man of his time, a soldier of his country, and a legend of the African continent, whose story will be told as long as there is a Nigeria to celebrate him. Thank you for journeying with us through this deep dive into one of the most pivotal moments in African history on tremendous crime in history. Our mission is to bring you the raw, unfiltered truth of the events that shaped our world, from the blood-stained streets of Lagos to the firing squads of Bar Beach. If you believe that history should be remembered so that its crimes are never repeated, then you belong in this community. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you can stay informed and engaged with our upcoming series on the most notorious heists and political hits in history. We want to hear from you. What other historical event has left a mark on your heart? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, stay curious, stay informed, and keep seeking the truth behind the headlines.